Welcome to the Chronological Christie podcast, in which a long-time Agatha Christie collector and her Christie novice husband discuss the works of the Queen of Crime in publication order. In this episode, we take a look at the second group of stories in the Partners in Crime short story collection.
Welcome to the Chronological Christie podcast. We are your hosts.
Gillian Porter, a long-time Agatha Christie reader and collector.
And her husband, Alan Porter, who after almost 40 years of sharing a house with Agatha Christie books, has decided he should read them.
We'll be tackling the books in UK publication order as detailed on the official Agatha Christie website and sharing our thoughts on each from the viewpoint of someone familiar with them
and someone reading them for the first time.
In this episode, we will be taking a look at the second set of stories in the Partners in Crime short story collection. These are fun and parody many of the detectives of the time, a different one for each story. All of the short stories were published in 1924 in various magazines, including The Sketch, The Grand Magazine, and Holly Leaves. The full collection was published in the UK and the US in 1929. As the collection includes a total of 17 stories, with some having adaptations, we split them into 3 episodes. In this episode, we will cover the second group of short stories in the collection.
At this point in the podcast, we would normally talk about what was going on in the world with Agatha the year of publication. However, as this is the second book published in the UK in 1929, we covered these in the episode on the Seven Dials mystery. This is our regular spoiler warning that during our discussions, we will be diving into plot and character details, as well as talking about who done it and why. And with that said, let's dive into the next group of stories from the Partners in Crime collection. As we'll be covering multiple stories, we changed the format a little for these collection episodes. I'll be tackling each story in turn as follows: the title, a synopsis, story discussion, and then a discussion of any adaptations. And with that, let's kick things off with the case of the missing lady. Having proved their deductive talents to the famous explorer Gabriel Stuyvesant, Tommy and Tuppence are entrusted with a new investigation discovering the whereabouts of his elusive fiancée. Tommy Beresford adopts a Holmesian mode for solving this case, even to the point of picking up a violin in his office. Beresford's technique is apparently pretty awful for Tuppence. In the Watson role, cries out, "If you must be Sherlock Holmes, I'll get you a nice syringe and a bottle labelled cocaine, but for God's sake, leave the violin alone." And on that, let's talk about the story itself and what we thought about it. And I'll kick things off. I didn't like this one at all. The Holmesian references seemed forced, and the banter between Tommy and Tuppence didn't read as natural this time around. When it comes to the victim and the missing lady, the idea that a supposedly intelligent and self-reliant woman, as she was described, would put herself through painful injections just to please a man is something I've never understood. Be it a quack slimming process like in this story, or Botox or plastic surgery in more recent times. If you love a person, then you love them for who they are, not how they look at one specific moment in time. People's bodies change, it's natural. Sorry, went off on a bit of a rant on that one, but I really didn't like the premise of this story at all and thought it completely undermined the character. And just didn't sit with my, if you like, personal moral compass at all. Well, so I guess that's about all I've got to say on this one. I'll leave it over to Jill, because I think she probably has a different opinion.
Well, I partially disagree with you. While I did find the Holmes banter a bit forced, I did enjoy the description of the reactions to Tommy playing the violin. I thought the detection side was pretty decent. They did all the right things. And I enjoyed their embarrassment when she wasn't actually missing. Quite funny. I quite enjoyed that part. Whether you agree with the woman's decision or not, it is hers to make. And I think the more important discussion is around how women have been made to feel somehow less for not conforming to the ideal women look published in magazines, social media, movies, and television. The pressure is enormous, and I struggle with it myself sometimes. But I do agree that changing yourself to please a man is wrong and means he is the wrong man for you. I am very lucky to have a man who loves me for who I am, not what I look like. And I wish that for everyone.
Oh, thank you very much. Actually, you bring up a good point, because I think they missed a trick in this story because Tuppence at one point, when the explorer guy who with the long Swedish name, Stavenson, says that he doesn't like fat women, Tuppence makes a remark about, well, the press would agree with you, which made me think that she didn't agree with that statement or the amount of pressure to look thin. But then again, she's fairly slim and sort of more to the ideal of the time herself anyway. But I just wish that's something that maybe Agatha Christie had explored a bit deeper rather than just be a throwaway remark like that. I
agree. She had an opportunity to do something, but she was a woman of her time. And maybe this is, that was her expectation, is if somebody says, I don't like fat women, then that was fine. He's allowed his choice. And in general, you are allowed your choice, but that doesn't mean that your partner should have to go out and do stupid stuff to conform to that choice.
Exactly. So I think we agree.
Yeah, I think we do in the end, but I did like the detection side. They did everything right. They did all the things that you'd expect them to do when at that point they thought she was missing. So I did like that part of the story because I felt like they were finally working out how to be a detective and doing all those things about finding her. I thought that part was solid, but it was the reason she was missing was a bit, as you said, it's a bit off. Okay, on to the adaptation. It was Agatha Christie's Partners in Crime, Season 1, Episode 9. And I want to know what went wrong partway through. The start was fun. Thankfully, they missed out the violin playing. And I felt like they were going to do another pretty solid, faithful adaptation when it all went wrong. All the tropes that could possibly be used were pretty offensive as well. They never really explained what everyone was doing at the house where they went. And that made me curious because Tuppence went there way overplaying it as a Russian ballerina. She was there for a rest cure. So was it a house where, from the short story, I got the impression it was a quack who did slimming things. But here, you get the impression that women were there for various different reasons. So that I found a little bit confusing. The acting was terrible. It was embarrassing to watch, to be honest. And if it hadn't have been, we were covering it for the podcast, I would have turned it off. The things we do, Alan, right, for our art.
Before I get into mine, I just want to pick up on something that you just said, which I didn't put in my notes, but struck me as well. The fact that when Tuppence was doing a Russian ballerina thing and that room, as you said, was full of patients, which made you think that they were there for other reasons or a variety of reasons. But the other thing that I suddenly thought of is none of them reacted to the fact that one other patient was constantly screaming in the night when she was having these painful injections.
I don't know. And something I don't think either of us actually talked about was the fact that she was tied to the bed. Obviously, it was the cure she'd asked for. But when you actually saw her, she was skinny. No, the other thing I wanted to mention as well is she was skinny. She did not need any slimming stuff. She'd only been there a few days. But also, that fat suit her aunt was wearing when they went to see her was just awful because she obviously wasn't fat. And it just played you again. And this is made in a different era. It just played you again on older women are fat. You know, as you get older, you get fat or whatever. And I found that offensive too. And I forgot to put it in my notes.
All right. Well, from my point of view, as Jill said, I agree with her. This started out so well. I thought the interactions between Tommy and Tuppence here were spot on. As with some of the physical actions, I thought it was quite funny. I liked the fact they dropped a lot of the Holmesian stuff and the focus was more on how they worked to impress the prospective client and gain his trust. And I thought that was good. I was a little worried about how they would make such a short story last an hour. And I thought things were on track for a smart, well thought out adaptation that could possibly surpass the source material. And then once they arrived at the clinic at the Grange, the house, it all fell apart. The smart duo was replaced by hammy acting, bad accents, stereotyped cartoon villains, and a cringeworthy music hall routine, and a farcical chase sequence that just went on and on. I almost expected the Benny Hill music to go to that chase sequence because it was so farcical. So as Jill said, it was a real disappointment that was almost unwatchable. And as she said, if we hadn't been watching it for the podcast, I think I would have agreed with her about switching it off because the second half of it was just unbelievably bad and so out of tune with everything else that we've seen so far in this series of adaptations. It was just weird. So,
yeah, definitely weird.
One adaptation that we have not, in this case, listened to was The Case of the Missing Lady, Also aired as the 12th episode in a 26-episode anthology series, The Nash Air Flight Theatre, on Thursday, 7th of December 1950, possibly under the title of The Disappearance of Mrs. Gordon. And this was a 30-minute live transmission on CBS. And there are different accounts as to who starred in the adaptation, which is interesting. Author Peter Haining states that the stars were Barbara Bell Geddes as Tuppence. She was in Dallas, wasn't she?
Yes.
She the matriarch in Dallas? Yeah.
Yes.
And Lee Bowman as Tommy. But other sources say that the stars were Ronald Reagan and Cloris Leachman. Very interesting. I don't know if that adaptation is available anywhere. I couldn't find it on a quick search online, but would love to. So I don't know if there's like tapes of these shows out there or something, but would be interesting to try and track that one down sometime. And that particular adaptation was written and directed by a gentleman called Mark Daniels. So again, if anybody knows if that's available on tape or online somewhere, I'd love to give it a listen. On with the next story, and over to Jill.
Blindman's Bluff. While lunching at the chic Gold Room, Tommy masquerades as a blind detective. The Beresfords are approached by the elegant Duke of Blairgowrie for help in locating his missing daughter. Before going off to aid the Duke, the blind Tommy dictates a vital menu to Tuppence. Here, Tommy is imitating Thornley Colton, the blind problemist. The sightless detective created by Clinton Holland Stagg, Colton depended on what he heard, felt, and smelt to solve his mysteries. Colton's eyes are his secretary, here played by Tuppence. I would say it was fairly obvious from the start what was going to happen. Again, not knowing the detective, the menu dictation wasn't something I understood, but indicated that someone was to be informed of what was happening. I did like the way that Tommy could actually see all the time, but pretended not to even when he was obviously being taken away somewhere to possibly be murdered. But I felt the whole electrocuted parts of the floor was a bit much for getting rid of someone. They could have just shot him in the car and dumped him. Rather overdramatic, and it fairly pointless in that respect. I've never understood the baddie that goes to these crazy lengths to try and kill somebody when, you know, if you don't care about leaving a body around lying around, it could actually be quite simple. What did you think, Alan?
Well, like you, I was unfamiliar with the blind problemist, Thornley Colton. But by the way, I love the title, Problemist. I think that's very cool. I think that would look good on a business card, don't you? And being a comics guy, it just reminded me of Marvel's Daredevil without the spandex, but obviously predates Daredevil by many decades, which is interesting. Actually made me wonder if Stan Lee was aware of the character of Thornley Colton.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but you maybe.
I enjoyed Tommy's attempts to teach himself how to operate in a world without sight, though, as Jill said, although in the end we do find out he's actually cheating and can see all the time. So that sort of undermined it a little bit. This was actually a little bit of a personal resonance because when I was a young lad, a stupid accident left me sightless for just over a week. And it's something I've been terrified of losing my sight again ever since. So I had a little bit of sort of understanding of what it's trying to navigate the world when you can't see, if only for a very short time. So when I found out Tommy was cheating, I sort of felt a bit, I don't know, I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but disappointed that he'd been cheating rather than actually trying. Peeved, that's a good word. Peeved, yes, I was peeved at Tommy. As for the villain's plans, yeah, they were, as you said, they were overly complicated, you know, the electrical things in the floor and all that sort of stuff. And I don't know, this is one of the tropes that really annoys me. Bad guys in fiction have plenty of opportunity in lots of stories just to get rid of the hero by simply shooting them. I know they spoofed that in the Austin Powers movies when it's like, just shoot the guy. Villains never seem to learn that the more convoluted the death trap, the more likely it is that the hero will escape. And this was one of those. So I enjoyed the mechanics of the story, but it was another where Tuppence was sidelined a bit. Her adventure was sort of resolved off page, which I'm not a fan of. I like the two of them together. I don't like it when she's sort of sidelined and then it's just like, oh, this thing happened to me while you were having your big adventure. I didn't sort of really go with that. There's no TV adaptation for this one because it actually plays into the blue envelope letter mystery that was set up earlier on and runs through several of the stories, but was not set up as part of the TV show.
The Man in the Mist. Recovering from a setback, failing to solve their latest case, Tommy and Tuppence are enjoying some cocktails when they stumble upon their next opportunity. a famous actress who appears to be terrified of a superstition. In this episode, Tommy imitates Father Brown, the Catholic priest detective created by G.K. Chesterton. In his guise, Tommy also carries Brown's characteristically shabby umbrella. What did you think of this one, Alan?
I actually know about Father Brown. My own father used to read his stories, and I used to catch the occasional episode of the TV show, which my dad also watched. But to be honest, other than the dog collar and the remark about the umbrella, this didn't really seem to rely on the Father Brown tropes that I know too much. The opening was very different, with our heroes disconsolate after being outfoxed on a case by the police. I thought that was also an interesting angle that sets up the implied trust in the forces of law. The accidental meeting in the hotel bar with the victim I thought was a bit too much of a coincidence. And it was never really explained how Tommy's friend knew her. He sort of just disappears from the story. The setup of the local ghost story was fun, as was Tuppence's reaction in the mist. Although, that seemed a little out of character for the Tuppence we know from other stories. As for the murder itself, at first it didn't appear to be that much of a mystery until Tommy started to look at it from a different angle, which I liked. I thought the payoff with the policeman being the murderer was brilliant, as it undermined that previously established inherent trust in the police, which is almost a common trope in most detective stories. The police are often shown as not as smart as the detective, or maybe bumbling or incompetent, but never as out-and-out villains, or very rarely. And I think this was another example of Christie breaking the rules of the genre in unexpected ways at the time. I thought that reveal of who the bad guy was very cool and very well done. What did you think, Joe?
I agree with you. I thought it was a nice twist. Like you, it's finally a sleuth I'm familiar with. Even if I don't particularly enjoy the books or the TV shows, I've heard of him. And I've tried to read the books and watch the TV shows. I did like the fact they had been beaten by the police in finding the thief of some jewelry, which made a nice change in these books. And I appreciated how they would feel low about it. But I did feel we really didn't get enough information about where they were and why they hadn't headed straight home. And where was Tommy's ever-present car? They're always in the car. So why were they talking about trains? That was something I was curious about. And who was the friend? His only job, obviously, was to introduce them to Gilda Glenn, and that was it. It was a very slight story, and it's definitely in a category of in a single leap the killer is found, which I do tend to find rather anticlimactic. But I did like how Tommy had worked out how the killer managed to escape unnoticed. The story was rather slim on detail, but it had enough to create a very interesting puzzle. Again, something she's very good at. Very good at just the descriptions of the mist and how you might feel anxious in that. Just shows how much she can actually get to come across in a really short period of time. This adaptation of Agatha Christie's Partners in Crime was Season 1, Episode 7. I thought this was a good adaptation. The additions made sense and added to the overall story rather than being just padding. I decided to look up who had adapted each episode, and this was adapted by Gerald Savory, who also adapted Finessing the King, which I enjoyed as well. And it made me think that it must be quite hard to write a 1-hour TV show from 2 very short chapters. So I do appreciate, even the ones we don't like, that the people who write the adaptations for the TV show aren't given very much to write with. So the fact that they can fill an hour and you enjoy it, it's pretty clever. It still didn't really explain why Gilda Glenn was happy to sit at Tommy and Tuppence's table, however briefly, at the invitation of Tommy's friend Bulger, as it seemed like she was avoiding him. But I guess I can live with that. It was a minor thing. I did like they gave Tommy's friend a bit more of a story to add a little bit more to the mystery of who killed Gilda Glenn. I thought the denouement was very clever with doing a reenactment and the arrest of the murderer. Although he still looked pretty pleased with himself when he was getting in the car, so maybe he didn't really care about being caught. What did you think, Alan?
Yeah, like you, I really like this adaptation. This was the correct way to expand on a slim story and make it seamlessly fill the 1-hour time slot. The additions made sense, and to use one of my favorite phrases, they served the story well. Expanding on the story of Tommy's friend Bulger in a way that made sense as to why he would be with the famous actress in the bar, and then adding his infatuation and his gullible nature, I think gave him depth and a purpose. having Tommy and Tuppence stay on a few days to try and figure out the mystery, and Tommy's slow realization on who was the potential suspect made more sense than having just a sudden moment of realization on the driveway as in the original text. It was also good to see that the murdering police constable was apprehended, which actually wasn't clear in the original short story as to whether he was caught or not. That just was basically Tommy figured it out, but there was no real resolution, which I liked that they did that here and actually showed him being arrested. Before we move on to discussing the other stories, we want to take a quick break to tell you about our new Patreon account, where you can now get early access to our podcasts, as well as our new Patreon-exclusive Agatha Adjacent podcast episodes. Patreon subscribers will also get the opportunity to submit questions for our bonus Q&A episodes. It's quick and easy to join our growing Patreon community, starting at the Greenway level for just $5 a month. Think about all that extra Agatha goodness for the price of a cup of coffee or tea, whichever is your preference. You can check it all out at patreon.com/chronological Christie. And thanks for your support.
Right, we move on to the Crackler this time. At Inspector Marriott's behest, Tommy and Tuppence sleuth after a clever counterfeiter who has been flooding both sides of the channel with phony banknotes. Tommy winds up in an alley with chalked X's over the doors, but what do they all mean? Well, that's annoying because I know from reading the story that that is not correct. I do hate a synopsis that misleads you.
I was just going to say that wasn't accurate. Yeah.
Nope. This short story sees the Beresfords as the Biddies in an Edgar Wallace type adventure which parodies Wallace's slapdash, action-laden thrillers. Wallace was the prolific, immensely popular author of 173 books, most of them thrillers or mysteries. During the 1920s, when he often dictated a book a week, he was one of the most widely read authors in England. We need several hundred yards of extra bookshelf if Edgar Wallace is to be properly represented, Tuppence says at one point, referring to Wallace's vast output. The case that Scotland Yard assigns to Tommy and Tuppence has strong connections with big money gamblers and horse racing. This was appropriate since Wallace himself was a compulsive gambler and squandered a good deal of the fortune he made from his books. His losses ran as high as $500 a day. Dan, back to a detective that while I've heard of the author, I don't really know much about his books. The story seemed pretty straightforward, and it was fairly obvious who the counterfeiter was once he decided to be all pally with Tommy. Yet again, Tuppence was left very much on the sidelines. I much prefer it when they work together, but I guess with parodying different detectives that were written back in the day, they're mostly going to be men, aren't they? It's always going to be that Tommy's going to get the bigger slice of the pie in all of these stories.
Good point. I hadn't thought of that.
I just thought of it myself, so there we go. The trick with the Valerian was very clever and pulled in why the cats were mentioned. We always need to remember Agatha Christie had a reason for everything that goes into her writing, short stories or full-length novels. What did you think of this one, Alan?
I don't really have much to add to your comments on this one. As you said, it's a straightforward story with a fairly obvious suspect. I did like the tie-in back to the early stories when she used the connections to St. Vincent and his wife, leveraged those connections to gain entrance to the racing set where the counterfeit money they'd been sent to trace was originating. So I thought that was clever. It was a nice callback. And again, not too keen on the fact, as we were just discussing, that these stories are getting progressively more Tommy-centric. The collection is entitled Partners in Crime, and that's what I want to read about. Tommy and Tuppence as equal partners. But I hadn't thought about what you just said about the fact they're pastiches of detectives at the time, and looking back, most of those would be male detectives. So good point.
Go me. So this was an adaptation of Agatha Christie's Partners in Crime, Season 1, Episode 10. This wasn't a bad adaptation. It just wasn't as enjoyable as the last one. I loved the interplay between Tommy Tuppence and Inspector Marriott. It was very cleverly choreographed and funny, passing around the counterfeit pound note along with the real one. I thought that was very clever. But I tell you what, after all the build-up with Tuppence going out and buying new dresses and fancy hats and getting herself all ready, I was very disappointed with the inside of the Python Club. It looked more like a village hall than one of the best nightclubs in London, very bare and minimally decorated. It reminded me of going to events with your mum and dad in the village hall. And wherever they tried to decorate something, your eyes never stopped at the decorations. They went beyond and you still felt like you were in that village hall. So no disrespect to the events we went to, but that's what it made me think of.
That made me laugh. Thank you.
Marguerite was way too much of a background figure than she was in the short story. And therefore, it was obvious that she wasn't involved in the counterfeiting. That was a bit too much of a big clue. Again, the problem with authors describing women as ethereally beautiful or having, the charm to pull these men in is you then have to find an actress who looks like that. And you never can, because nobody ever looks like those descriptions. I mean, she was pretty, but I wouldn't have called her that. And they didn't play her like she wasn't always surrounded by a group of men. So I thought they lost a point on that because it would have made her seem more important. I always love Albert getting some screen time. So that was fun to see him doing some stuff. It stayed pretty faithful to it, though, and I liked that. But it did drag a bit in the middle as not much happened, apart from them all drinking the cocktail, the horse's neck. That got a bit tedious for me. I assume when Albert followed Laidlaw and his people he was with, that they were working on scams for the horse racing. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know what you thought of that part either, Alan. That was all a bit mystifying to me. I can't imagine anything worse than getting all dressed up and doing the same thing night after night with the same people either. Much prefer my sweatpants and hanging out at home doing whatever I want. What did you think this time, Alan?
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty good adaptation that did a fair job of expanding the story to fit the time. Like you said, it was nice to see Albert get some out of the office action in this one. I liked his old AGS motorcycle he was riding. Of course, it wouldn't be older to him, but to me, it was an old one. Some of the additional stuff that they put in to sort of pad it didn't really make sense, and some of the changes, I wasn't sure why they made the change to having Major Laidlaw be blind when it really didn't impact the plot in any way or pay off in any way. And I thought having his father-in-law tap out the cards on his arm while they were playing Chemin de Fer might be significant. But no, that there was no payoff for that. And as you said, there was no explanation of the money exchange at the pub on the way to or from the races. I couldn't quite figure out which, from something Albert said, I think it was on the way back from the races, but I wasn't sure. But yeah, again, I wasn't quite sure what the point of that exchange of that big wad of cash was. I also wasn't sure of the point of having Tommy's friend, Jimmy Faulkner, be so besotted with Tuppence. Jimmy Faulkner in this adaptation being the person who got them into the club, as opposed to St. Vincent in the source material. So a new character, but again, why he was fawning all over Tuppence, other than the fact, if you're going to go for the most beautiful girl in that room, I think it was Tuppence. I don't think it was Marguerite.
Agreed. Can I just interject there?
Yeah.
I think that was to give Tuppence something to do. So that she was dancing and hanging out while she was actually really doing nothing there. I don't know. They tend to write things to make Tommy feel unbalanced about how Tuppence feels about him.
It was nice to find out that Tommy's car was mentioned as being a Bentley, as that was bugging me a bit from previous episodes that we watched, as I hadn't figured it out. And then later on in another episode, there was a shot and there was a great big Bentley badge right on the front of it. I was like, duh. But anyway, it was nice to see Shane Rimmer on screen. I always like seeing him, and having him play the bad guy was neat. He seemed to have fun playing the drunk along the way. The location shots, we mentioned this at the end as we were watching it, seemed a bit off too. As they were driving through the narrow streets, that really sort of did evoke the Whitechapel area, foggy, misty, narrow streets, crammed housing. But when they pulled up at to get out of the car, suddenly it was sort of suburbia and grass verges, and then they went down a back alley, like one of the old back alleys in Manchester with the outhouses and stuff, and where the warehouse was meant to be looked like the entrance to somebody's backyard rather than a warehouse. So I don't know, where the location pieces were filmed at the end really didn't tie together properly to my mind. Maybe just being a bit picky there, but they really didn't flow in a natural way that I felt they were in the same place. It felt like they were moving from location to location to location, rather than it being a cohesive journey, if that makes sense.
It does, and you're not wrong.
So the more I think about it, maybe it wasn't as good as an adaptation as I thought. I thought while they were faithful to the source material, unlike the last one, the extra sequences and changes really didn't add anything to it, in my opinion.
Actually, they just gave us more questions than they did anything else. So that's very interesting.
And on to our last story for this episode, the Sunningdale mystery. Captain Cecil is found stabbed through the heart with a hat pin. The only clue, a bit of red wool in his hand. A pretty blonde is charged because she was wearing a bright red wool coat. But the Berefords don't like how the investigation is being handled. Was there more behind the killing than the pretty blonde and the red wool? Tommy Beresford imitates the old man in the corner, the greatest of armchair detectives, a character created by Baroness Emma Orsi, who also created the Scarlet Pimpernel, if I remember correctly. Anyway,
she did, yes.
The old man, who remains nameless, solves his mysteries while sitting in the corner of a tea shop. Information on the cases is brought to him by Polly Burton, a young reporter for the Evening Observer. The old man ponders his cases while tying and untying knots in an old piece of string which he carries with him, a habit that Tommy copies in his story. Tuppence, logically, takes the role of Polly Burton. Onto the story itself, it was interesting to see Christie attempt another thought experiment type case where the detective never goes to the scene of the crime. If I recall, the Poirot Investigates collection too. The title of that particular story escapes me, but I remember there was one. And I think this one worked better as it was kept on point and engaging, even though it was essentially nothing but pages of exposition. As Tommy told the story, it became clear that the golf partner's son could be the potential suspect, as he was just suddenly mentioned without any prior context. Having Inspector Marriott just happen to be sat at the next table in the tea room and listening was a bit of a stretch for me. And am I really expected to believe that a couple as observant as Tommy and Tuppence, who started off remarking about some of the finer points of the waitresses and their attitudes in the tea shop, didn't notice that Inspector Marriott happened to be sat at the table next to him? That was a coincidence too far, I thought. Anyway, Jill, what did you think?
Oh, I agree with you about Inspector Marriott. That was a bit cheeky, but she's Agatha Christie. She can do what she likes. I thought this was a very Poirot story. Apart from the fact Tuppence, playing the investigator Polly Burton, just listened, so that was very disappointing. Because it just reminded me of a story where Poirot would send Miss Lamont and Hastings off to do things. So that was my thought there. The solution to the crime was very clever, but I agree with Alan, it was a little bit too much exposition. I was hoping the adaptation was more interesting. And let's move on to that. This was Agatha Christie's Partners in Crime, Season 1, Episode 3. I thought this was a really good adaptation. It was still told mostly as that exposition by Tommy, but the murder was told in flashback, as Tommy explained, which I really liked. I thought putting the slightly misty thing around the telling of the crime itself and the people involved really helped with the storytelling. So you didn't feel like you're getting whiplash going backwards and forwards. It made it very clear that these were the pictures, this is what he was telling you about. I also thought that adding Tommy and Tuppence travelling to Sunningdale and walking the course really pulled it all together, especially with their asides and Tuppence's humour. Her obsession with hats always adds humour, and I love the whole thing between Tommy and Albert over the scissors. Tommy wanted some, and Albert comes in and they're right in the drawer by Tommy's right hand. Thought that was pretty funny. The scene in the ABC was made so much better by the actress, played wonderfully by Dorothea Phillips. She played it so well. One thing else I wanted to say, so Jonathan Hale wrote the adaptation for the Sunningdale mystery. He also wrote them for the case of the missing lady.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it really shows the difference because that one was so terrible. And this one, while it was still all exposition, with Tommy and Tuppence moving around and Tuppence making asides and the slightly sauciness going on between them, really brought the story alive. I thought did a really good job with it. I will say, though, the woman in her red coat, who on earth goes to a man's house after you've had tea with him in a tea shop, met him once? That part, I did not understand at all. That bonkers, right?
Yeah, but that's in the story. It's in the story. So, and they kept to it. But I meant in the story that I know people can be stupid, and I guess that's where she was going with it. I thought it was done really well. Probably one of my favorites, actually, so far, I think. What did you think? Actually, before I get to mine, I actually want to go back to a point of yours that ties back to the previous episode, which was about the sets. The ABC tea room. The actress who played the waitress, Dorothea Phillips, was wonderful because she was clearly listening into the story that Tommy was telling, but didn't want to be seen to be listening into the story that Tommy was telling. And just her facial expressions and body language was great. What got me with that was, from what I've seen of photographs of ABC tea rooms from back then, they got the uniforms of the waitresses spot on. But again, like the nightclub in the previous one, the set dressing was very bland and didn't look like what I've seen of ABC tea rooms. And it's easy to find out. So I'm guessing that may be just a budget thing.
Maybe, but then when they get to the hotel, their room was quite sumptuous. So if that was part of a budget thing, then it begs the question of why one was wrong and the other one looked kind of almost overly fancy for a hotel by a golf course.
I don't know. They probably thought, it's good enough. It's not like some guy in 30 years is going to be sitting there picking it apart. So what did I think of this one? I was actually concerned with this one, having read the source material, because it is just Tommy telling a story, that they would do the same thing as they did with the similar Poirot story and take the detective and put him right there in the middle of the action on location. But as Jill noted, they didn't. They stayed as an exposition-driven narration by Tommy. One of the things I liked is Tommy was telling the story over several days at different locations. It started out in the tea shop, but as they were moving around, he told different parts of the story, which I think made more sense because it gave Tommy and Tuppence more time to digest and discuss various ideas of the case, rather than it just being a continuous stream of conscious thing in the tea room, which I liked. I think that made a lot more sense. I also applaud the direction in that you never got to see the victim, Cat Cecil's face, but instead you saw the murderer who was impersonating him without knowing that you were watching the man who'd done it. And I thought that was very clever. Obviously, having read the story, we knew it, but if you've never read the story, it was like you assume that that's Captain Cecil right up front. And then it's only later on, it's like, oh, no, it's not. It was a guy who was impersonating him. So I thought that was very clever.
Oh, I did too. I thought the direction and doing that misleading thing was very clever. And I also, what I meant to say, sorry to interrupt you again, I meant to say when I was talking about Tuppence's obsession with hat is the whole time we've been watching the adaptations, the trend was for those close fit, pull-on cloches or cloches, I don't know how you pronounce it. And so that conversation about men being old-fashioned and taking a long time to adapt, they don't really notice that much about women's fashion, that idea from the father and son that killing him with a hat pin was going to incriminate a woman when a young woman was going to be wearing a very close-on hat that wasn't coming off even without a hat pin was very clever, and also fed into Tuppence being able to talk about hat.
Yeah, I thought that was a great observation by Christie because, she talks about that in the actual story, doesn't she?
Yes.
About the fact that fashion's changed and less than 20% of women bother with a hat pin these days. So I thought that was great. And the fact that they carried it on. And I loved that unspoken joke about a hat obsession here was when they were in the Bentley, that there's that tower of hat boxes balanced precariously in the back of the Bentley, wobbling in the wind. I thought it was, it was like one suitcase and then this tower of hat boxes. I thought was really funny. They never really sort of made a point of it. It was just there in the background. It was like, if you know, you know. But yeah, I thought that was a good visual gag.
And it makes it, hang on a minute, and it makes it all the more interesting that this was written by the guy who wrote about the missing woman. And there were no subtle things in that at all. Whereas in this, there were quite a few.
I wonder if that was down to a different director, maybe. We need to check on
Maybe.
And on that mystery, that wraps it up for us for this episode. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Chronological Christie podcast. If you would like to leave a rating or a review on your favorite podcast platform, that would be great. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. If you'd like to discuss any aspect of this episode, you can message us on the Chronological Christie Instagram account, a link for which will also be in the show notes. Or you can find us on various social media platforms. Jill, where can you be found?
I can be found on the Chronological Christie Instagram, TikTok, and Threads accounts, and my author TikTok under Gilly Kent.
And I can be found on most social platforms by searching for @AlanJPorter or via my author's website at alanjporter.com. If you want to keep up with our various writing projects, you can sign up for our free bi-weekly newsletter at alanjporter.substack.com.
The books discussed on this podcast can be found on a dedicated chronological Christie section of our online bookstore at bookshop.org. The link will also be in the show notes. And talking of bookshop.org, it's also the place where you can buy our latest books online while still supporting your local independent bookstore. Check out my new novel, Trust Issues, a light romantic thriller that's getting great reviews, and Alan's new collection of Victorian-era adventure short stories, Saloons, Jungles, and City Streets, featuring Wild Bill Hickok, Alan Quatermain, and Sherlock Holmes. Please join us for our next episode where we will discuss the final stories from the Partners in Crime collection. We look forward to you joining us.
The music used in this episode was extracted from I'm Somebody Somebody Now by the Joe Venuti Orchestra and is a public domain recording. The Chronological Christie podcast is a production of Megrin Entertainment, a division of 4J's Group, LLC.